What's up, 8th grade? Mr. Agnost here. This video is for homework 14-3. And what we're going to start doing this week is looking at scatter plots and identifying patterns. And this is what graphs are really good for. Graphs give us a visual representation of some information. And by looking at them, we can identify trends or patterns, right? That can then allow us to make predictions about whatever it is that we're measuring. So the first type of pattern that we're going to look at is the idea of a cluster and the idea of an outlier. So a cluster, like maybe a cluster of people, is a group, kind of all packed together. And an outlier is something that is kind of out by itself, right? So question number 1 here says identify the cluster in the graph, right? Well, if you look at this scatter plot here, we can kind of see that it has two distinct pieces. We have all these points that are down right here, kind of in a group, and then we have this lonely fellow up over here, right? So down here on the right, this is what we call a cluster, right? Cluster of grapes, cluster of people, whatever. It's a group kind of all packed together. And when we have a point that's off all by itself, we call that an outlier. And it's important to be able to identify this because it can indicate, like, why is this point an outlier? Right? You would immediately ask that question. What was there a mistake made when we were doing our information? Is there one piece of information that is so different than everyone else? I mean, maybe an example of this would be, hey, if I asked everyone in the classroom to say how tall they were. Well, most people are going to be between 5 and 6 feet tall, right? And so if we were graphing that, we would have a cluster between 5 and 6 feet. But what if we had like a student that was 7.5 feet tall? Right? You would see this one dot way off. So that's important to know because that kind of information can mess with the average, right? It can make the class seem taller than they actually are. Another classic example is you have a neighborhood where everyone makes, $25,000 a year, but then there's one millionaire right on the street. And if you take the average salary of everyone on the street, the average is going to look quite high, because you have a person that's a millionaire living there, and that drags the average way up. But it's not an accurate reflection of the people that actually live there. So same idea here. We want to, outliers, there's a reason it's an outlier, and we want to know what that reason is. And there's a reason that things cluster, and we want to know what that reason is. All right, so how do we name this cluster? How do we identify it? Well, you just want to look, like, what are the x coordinates and what are the y coordinates that sort of create this box? Well, around the cluster. Well, if you look, that my cluster sort of starts at an x coordinate of 10 and it ends at an x coordinate of 14. And if we're thinking about y coordinates, it starts at a y coordinate of 0 and it ends at a y coordinate of 4. Now, the x is measuring our row numbers. So we're looking for rows 10 to 14. There's a cluster between row 10 and 14 and between seat 0 and seat 4. Right? I'll make this match with colors. So there's my 0, there's my 4, 0, and 4. So by identifying the x coordinates, right, the beginning, the end, the y coordinates, the beginning and the end, we've identified our cluster. If you look at the other choices, this one says between row 10 and row 12. Well, and I'll actually draw a box here, and between seats 0 and 2. So if I was going with choice B here, my box would only look like this, right? Between 10 and 12 and 0 and 2. And you can see how that discludes, if that's a word, these other points. And I'll do the last one as well. Between row 12 and 14, so we go from there to there, and between seats 2 and 4. So that would be a box that's just drawn right here. Right. So in our case, there's a cluster between 10 and 14 and seats 0 and 4. So there's our cluster. And again, the next thing would be like if we were scientists or mathematicians, we'd be like, why? Why is there a cluster here? What does that cluster mean? Right? Does this represent, hey, this is where something should normally be, but then what's up with this other point up here? Do we have an 8 foot tall person in the room for some reason? All right. So that's how you identify a cluster. Let's look at number 6. I'm going to skip to number 6. We're talking about an outlier. So in this graph, it represents the price and number of items sold. All right. So I'll zoom in on this graph. So on the x-axis, we're measuring the number of items. So again, I'm just going to pick a point here. I'm going to pick this point right here. And that point, let's see, 15, 16, 17. So 17 items, whatever they are, sold for $15. So this is the point 17, comma 15, right? So 17 items sold for $15. Maybe we're having a garage sale or something. We sold 17 things for 15 bucks each. All right. Well, you can very clearly see we have a cluster here, but we also have this one guy way off by himself over here. So all they ask you to do is to identify the outlier point. Type an ordered pair. All right, so we just need to know the coordinates of this point. So my x-coordinate, it looks like it is 10. And the y-coordinate is 40. So most of the stuff was let's see, 22, 23 bucks or less. But then for some reason we had this one type of item that we're selling for 40. So it's kind of this outlier, right? A lot of cheap stuff, but then this more expensive group of items up here. So make sure that when you're typing in your outlier, you have to put parentheses, 10, comma, 40, and then you have to put close parentheses. And then, not for this question, but there are other questions where they actually have more than one outlier. So then you would put another comma on the outside there, and you would do, I'll just make something up. You would type in 2 coordinate pairs like this. Okay, I think the hardest thing about this assignment is not the concept of a cluster or an outlier, right? You're just looking for a group, and you're looking for the ones that are not in a group. It's the reading the actual graphs. The scale on some of the graphs is not obvious. Sometimes it's by decimals, sometimes it's by 2s, sometimes it's by 3s. On a lot of the questions, you have to make the graph. In other words, they give you a table of information, just like we did last week in 14-2, and you have to construct the graph. By construct, they mean, hey, which graph is it? And then once you've figured out which graph it is, then you have to identify the clusters and the outliers. All right. So my suggestion is really zoom in on the graphs. Make sure you understand what the scale is, right? Because I think when I did the assignment just a few minutes ago, that was the hardest part. I was like, I was looking and trying to figure out what's the scale here and whatnot. Okay. Again, these videos are not meant to give you everything that you need to know to do this lesson. It's just meant to give you that little spark to get you started. I fully expect for you guys to ask lots of questions in class. And remember, if I go over a problem with you, right, then you're not moving on to the next one. Once you're finished, you're hitting similar question and making sure you can do it on your own. All right, I will see you guys in class.